pray. Amen.
All God's people said, amen. Well, good morning again, Trinity family, and a special welcome to those of you who might be joining us for the first time as we are continuing today with week 2 of our Priorities series. I want to begin this message with a story. It's a story about a lighthouse keeper who was given just enough oil to keep the light in the lighthouse burning for 1 month. His assignment was that simple, just keep the light in the lighthouse burning every night for 1 month. Well, as the story goes, a woman came knocking on the door of the lighthouse keeper, asking for oil so that her children could stay warm. The lighthouse keeper felt compassion for the woman's situation, so he gave her just a little bit of oil to help her out. Next day, a farmer comes with a request. His son needs oil for his lamp in order to do his homework. And again, the lighthouse keeper still had plenty of oil, and so he gave him some of it. The next day, the other townspeople are catching wind of the lighthouse keeper's generosity, and so they come with their requests. Each prayer request seems worthy enough. You know, they're pleading with him, can I just have a little bit of oil? And so he gives them a little bit of oil. Each request is met by this lighthouse keeper. But at the end of the month, the oil in the oil tank runs dry. That night, the beacon is dark, and a ship crashes on the rocks, and lives are lost. Right? During the investigation, the lighthouse keeper tries to explain what he had done with the oil. There were so many needs, he said. These people were pleading with me. How could I say no to these worthy requests? To which the investigator responded, as lighthouse keeper, you were given one job. Keep the light in the lighthouse burning. Everything else was secondary. There is no defense. Now, I don't think that story's true, but I love that story. Here's why I love that story. It reminds me that as important as it is to say yes to whatever God is calling me to, it is also vitally important to say no to whatever distracts me from what he's calling me to. I said this last week to kick off this series. Our lives get shaped primarily by the way we use those two little words, yes and no. Really, think about it. Our lives get primarily shaped by the way we use those two little words, yes and no. And I'm not just talking about saying no to blatant sins and wickedness and really bad stuff. Right? I'm talking about saying no to good people, worthy causes, even your pastor when he invites you to something, right? If it's going to distract you from the things that God is calling you to. We saw this last week as we began this priority series, that even Jesus said no to good people and worthy requests if they were a distraction from what his Father was calling him to. Same thing is true for us. We need to be able to say no to anything and anyone that's distracting us from what we know God is calling us to. Because if Satan can't get us to be bad, he'll try to get us to be busy, right? Going in 1,000 different directions, distracting us from the very things that God is calling us to. Last week, I gave you a bunch of reasons why you and I say yes when we should probably say no. I want to rehearse those just once more, just to try to make some eye contact, because there's a struggle in us to say no. So if you want to follow along in your notes, there's lots of reasons we say yes when we should probably say no. Some of us say yes because we don't want to disappoint people. Right? Some of us say yes because we're told no one else can do it, and we just can't imagine not having that thing get done that's so important, and so we begrudgingly do it, not necessarily because God's calling us to, but we just can't imagine it not getting done. Some of us say yes because someone really needs us to do it, and we don't know how to say no when someone approaches us with a need. A lot of us say no because of our fear of missing out. FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. This has even become one of those tags. Fear of missing out. We say yes when we should say no. Some of us say yes because we crave a sense of significance, and we're still trying to attain significance by what we can do for Christ rather than who we are in Christ. Right? Some of us say yes because we're still seeking God's acceptance. We don't really understand the gospel. We're still trying to work our way into God's favor. Some of us say yes because we're people pleasers. And the pain of saying no to someone seems too great, and so it's just easier to say yes and pay the consequences of that yes than to say no and know someone's going to be disappointed with us. For some of us, it's difficult to say no because we don't want to feel guilty. We don't want to feel lazy. It's self-induced, right? And then for some of us, it's a struggle to say no because consciously or subconsciously, we don't think it's very Christian to say no to good people and worthy causes, right? I explained this kind of thinking last week, right? That the idea here is that Jesus went to the cross, Right? Jesus died for our sins. He was in my place, taking the punishment that was due me. And so how can I then say no to the comparably painless requests that come my way? It just doesn't seem very Christ-like. It doesn't seem to honor Jesus who paid the ultimate price for me. But here's the problem with that logic. As we saw last week, even just a brief survey through the Gospels shows us that Jesus said no to people all the time. Jesus said no to requests all the time. Right? He loved people, but he did not walk this earth as some cosmic bellhop at the beck and call of what people wanted or needed. No, Jesus was so focused on his Father's will, the priorities that his Father had set for him, that anyone who made a request of him that distracted him from those priorities received a clear and unapologetic no. And today I want us to look at one of those occasions where Jesus said no. So if you have a Bible, I invite you to turn with me to Luke 10, beginning in verse 38, as we look at a story where Jesus says no to three things that might surprise you. Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Now, before we dig into this scripture, I want to give you a little bit of context. Jesus and his disciples, here in Luke 10, in fact, if you were to go back to the very beginning of Luke 10, Jesus and his disciples, they've been on a mission trip, right? They've been traveling abroad. They've been teaching about the kingdom. And so here they are now, tired from the journey. They're ready to settle in for a meal and some rest. And so they stop at the home of Mary and Martha, two of Jesus' close friends, right? Who have experienced Jesus' forgiveness, who are grateful to be a part of his team. In other words, Mary and Martha are not just random women in this story, right? They are beloved friends of Jesus, right? Who have experienced his forgiveness, who are now filled with gratitude for who he is and what he's done for them. They're friends. Nevertheless, despite their close friendship, Jesus tells Martha no to three things that many of us struggle to say no to. And the first one was this. Jesus said no to lots of activity. Jesus said no to lots of activity. Notice in verse 40, Luke says, Martha was distracted by all the preparations that needed to be made. All the preparations that needed to be made. Evidently, Martha was a busy little bee, right? Running around, getting things ready for Jesus' arrival. But Jesus was not looking necessarily for lots of frenetic activity. Right? Jesus was not expecting, nor was he impressed with all the stuff that Martha was trying to get done. In fact, Martha's frenzied activity actually brought a gentle rebuke from Jesus. Look at verse 41. It says, you are worried, just as Jesus speaking, you are worried and upset about many things, Jesus says, but only one thing is needed. In other words, doing more, according to Jesus, does not necessarily equate to doing better. Doing more does not necessarily equate to doing better. Which then begs the question, or should lead us to ask the question of ourselves, many of us at least, then why are we killing ourselves cramming so many things onto the calendar? Right? Why are we killing ourselves cramming so many things onto the calendar? Well, one of the reasons is because you and I, like Martha, we crave significance. Right? And it's not bad to crave significance. Right? Martha knew it was significant that Jesus was coming to her house. Right? This was an important occasion. And so she jumps at the chance to do something for Jesus. And it's good for us to look for ways to serve Jesus. But somewhere along the way, Martha realizes that she doesn't have enough time to accomplish everything that she's trying to get done. At which point, she tries to guilt her sister Mary into helping her. By the way, how many of you, when you're feeling overwhelmed with your to-do list, have the spiritual gift of guilting others into helping you? Right. How many of you know someone with that gift? How many of you are sitting next to that person? Don't go there. Right, that's what's happening here with Martha. She's She's very sincere in her desire to serve Jesus. But she's hit the ceiling of her limitations. And she realizes that she can't do it all. Let me say that again. She hits the ceiling of her limitations, and she realizes that she can't do it all. Friends, it is a gift from God when we hit the ceiling of our limitations. It doesn't feel like a gift, right? We think, no, I should be able to do more, but it's actually a gift when we hit the ceiling of our limitations. In fact, one of the lies that many of us buy into is that God will supply all the energy, all the time, all the resources that we need to do any number of things that come across our path, right? And it makes sense. God is omnipotent, right? And he lives within us through faith in Christ by his Spirit. And so if I've got God living within me, surely I can do another thing, and another thing, and another thing, right? We buy into this lie that we're free from the rule of limitations, but we're not. We can't do it all. We can't. And it's an act of humility to acknowledge that. And so when we hit that ceiling of our limitations, that's when it's time for us to hit pause and consider whether what we're doing is really God's will, or whether it's just something that we want to do, or whether it's something that someone else wants us to do. There's a difference, right? See, if I know that what I'm doing is what God has called me to do, then when I start to fret about whether or not I have time to do it, that anxiety, that feeling of being overwhelmed, it really can be swallowed up by the truth that there is sufficient time to do the whole will of God, right? That's the truth. You can take that to the bank. There is sufficient time to do the whole will of God. Folks, there have been seasons in my life when I've needed to recite this mantra several times a day to remind myself that God will help me do what he's called me to do. There is sufficient time to do the whole will of God. But there have been other times when my anxiety about my to-do list is simply the byproduct of me saying yes to someone or something when I should have said no. Right? Maybe I signed on to something because I didn't want to disappoint someone, or because I didn't know how to say no, or because I just wanted to do it. And then here's what happens. I hit the ceiling of my limitations, and I start calling out to God to bail me out. Right? I start pleading with God to miraculously create 28 hours in a day so that I can do this thing that he never really asked me to do. I was having this conversation with Amanda a few days ago where I was like, I've got this idea, and I don't know if it's God's, but if it's not, could he adopt it as his own? Right? And that's how a lot of us are. We've got this agenda, we've got this to-do list. We're not sure if it's all God's agenda for us, but maybe he could just adopt it as his own. Couldn't he do that for us? Right? Oswald Sanders writes this: often the pressure a spiritual leader feels comes from assuming tasks that God has not assigned. For such tasks, the leader cannot expect God to supply the extra strength required. How's that for a pep talk? Don't expect God to supply the extra strength you need. Yeah, that's your next step. Go home and stencil that peppy little quote onto your wall, right? I don't want you to misunderstand me on this point. God loves to come through for us. God loves to give us his strength. God loves to help us in those things that he's called us to, at home, at work, with those causes that are close to his heart. We really can trust that there is sufficient time to do the whole will of God. But we should not think that those words are some magical incantation that we can use to manipulate God into helping us maintain some insanely busy schedule that he never called us to, right? Martha tried that one, right? That's what she's trying to do here. She's trying to get Jesus to bail her out, right? She's pleading with Jesus to send Mary in to help her with all of the stuff that she needed to get done. And Jesus' response to Martha is instructive for us. He says no, because he's not necessarily looking for lots of activity. That's number one. Number two is this, if you're following along in your notes. Jesus also said no to me-centered service. Jesus says no to me-centered service. I want you to notice how Martha slips into quite a bit of me talk in her conversation with Jesus. Her work, her job, her running around, it's all about her. Look at the end of verse 40. She says this: Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Right? 3 times in just one verse, Martha reveals the self-centered nature of her service. Martha's service is more about Martha than it is about Jesus. Martha here doesn't even stop to ask Jesus if what she's doing is what Jesus wants her to be doing. She, like a lot of us, just assumes that her agenda is Jesus' agenda, or just wants her agenda to be Jesus' agenda. Folks, just because we're serving doesn't mean that our service can't become all about me. And let me just say, pastors are the worst culprits of me-centered service, especially if the church is growing. Because service then often becomes this means to success. And I'm putting that in air quotes because it's usually worldly measurements of success that we're looking at. See, oftentimes a pastor, if he's successful, he now has to serve even more diligently to protect his image of being successful. And this isn't just a pastor thing, right? Like, success in any field can breed a me-centered drive to protect our image, right? So, for example, if we do well in school, that can become our identity, right? Such that we then have to work even harder to maintain that successful image. Or we do well in our job, and that becomes our identity, and we feel compelled to work even harder to maintain that successful image. Same thing can happen in the church, right? We can serve well, and people notice us, and they give us accolades, and then pretty soon, if we're not careful, we can end up on this serving treadmill, doing more and more, running harder and harder, trying to maintain this image of a faithful servant of Jesus. Right? This kind of me-centered service happens all the time in churches. Happens all the time. And I know I risk something when I say this. It's like I had someone in the lobby after the first service say, well, I was going to sign up to do this thing, but after that message, maybe I'll take a pass. I'm willing to risk it, folks. I want us to be a church that is so excited about what God is doing around here and what he's doing in people's lives that I would feel negligent if I didn't put the ask before you. But I also want to have a church family where there's a context of no guilt so that you can freely say no to whatever it is that people are asking you to do so that you can say yes to what you sense God's calling you to do. I want both. So excited about what God's doing, I'm going to keep putting those asks before you, but with a no guilt environment so that you can keep saying no to what you need to say no to so that you can say yes to what you're supposed to say yes to. Pastors are the worst at this. Point of confession, I fell into this trap of me-centered service several years ago during a stretch of ministry in another church where the church was growing, good things were happening, and the temptation for me was to keep adding more service responsibilities to my plate in order to maintain the growth of the church and, if I'm really honest, my image as a successful pastor. See, the reason I didn't want to let off on the gas wasn't because I was going at the pace that Jesus was calling me to go at. It was because I was afraid of losing momentum on the train of success. Right? I could feel myself getting distracted and divided from some of those things that I knew God had called me to. But I didn't want to say no, in part because it would have jeopardized me accomplishing more. And friends, more can become a dangerous four-letter word if we're not careful. When J.P. Getty, one of the world's first billionaires, was interviewed and asked how much more money he needed beyond his billions, his response was just a little bit more. Just a little more. Just a little bit more is the motto of lots of people who are driven to succeed. Lots of people who are driven to succeed. The taste of success, whether it's at work or at school or in sports or even in the serving arena here at church, it can create this insatiable thirst for just a little bit more, right? Which then keeps us striving just a little bit harder, such that in the end we find ourselves exhausted on a treadmill that never lets us up, right? And why is that? Well, it's because, as Robert McGee says, today's success never lasts much past midnight. Tomorrow I got to get up and do it all over again, right? Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Today's success never lasts much past midnight. Tomorrow I got to get up and do it all over again, right? It's like a rat race. Personally, I love the way comedian Lily Tomlin talks about the rat race. She says, the trouble with being in the rat race is that even if you win, you're still a rat, right? Folks, if productivity was all that Jesus cared about, he would have let Martha keep firing away on all cylinders, right? Driven by her own little kingdom agenda. I mean, Martha was probably getting a lot done. But Jesus loved Martha enough to gently rebuke her. to tell her that her me-centered service was not the kind of service that he was looking for. Right? So number one, Jesus said no to lots of activity. Number two, Jesus said no to me-centered service. And number three, Jesus said no even to ministry. Now, this point really builds on the last one, but it takes it further. Because Jesus' rebuke of Martha also highlights that there are times when even ministry, even if it's not me-centered ministry, even ministry needs to play second fiddle to something else. And at this point, my guess is that some of you are thinking, well, is Martha really doing ministry? I mean, she's making some dinner, she's setting the table, but she's not ministering, right? Wrong. Particularly in the first century, hospitality was viewed as one of the most significant forms of ministry there was. It was not second-class ministry. It was real first-class ministry. In fact, the clue that Martha was engaged in real ministry is found in the word that Luke uses in verse 40 to describe what she was doing. It says this: Martha was distracted by all the preparations. The Greek word behind this preparations is diakonia. Right? It's where we get the word deacon. Deacon being one of the ministry titles of those who serve in the church. In other words, Martha was taking on real, significant ministry responsibility. She was doing diakonia. She was a deaconess, right? Diakonia. This is also why Martha is so upset. She knows that there's someone else in the house who's capable of helping her with the diakonia, the important ministry that she's trying to do for Jesus. That's why she asks Jesus to help Mary to help her, which seems like a legitimate request, right? And yet Martha's request for help was met by what must have been a shocking response from Jesus in verse 42. No, Martha, Mary has chosen what is better. It will not be taken from her. I wish I could communicate how radical a statement Jesus is making here. Jesus tells Martha that sitting at his feet is more important than doing ministry. Now, point of clarification, this was not Jesus' way of setting Mary up on a pedestal based on her contemplative disposition over against Martha's tendency to be a doer. That's typically how I've heard this passage preached. That's typically how I've heard this passage interpreted. That's not what's going on here. That's not what Jesus is saying. This is not a story about how being is better than doing. And the reason I know that is just the context. Like if you just look at Luke chapter 10, you don't even have to go any further than just the beginning of Luke chapter 10. The Good Samaritan story takes place right before this episode. And the Good Samaritan story, if you remember, it's all about doing something. The punchline of Jesus' story is go and do likewise. All right? So Jesus is not elevating being over and against doing. No, the key to understanding what's going on in this story is this little phrase, sitting at Jesus' feet. Sitting at Jesus' feet. Listen to verse 39 again. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. Here's what you need to understand. The phrase that I want you to key into. Here, Mary sat at Jesus' feet. You need to understand that this phrase, sitting at Jesus' feet, it's a first century euphemism for a rabbi-disciple relationship. To sit at someone's feet was a way of saying, I am becoming this rabbi's disciple. I'm sitting at their feet. They're now my spiritual authority. I'm putting myself under their tutelage, right? So when Mary sits at Jesus' feet, she's choosing to be his disciple, which meant listening to him, finding out what he wanted her to be doing, and then going out and doing whatever he called her to do. Friends, in 30 words, that's discipleship. Right? Listening to Jesus through the study of his word and through listening to his voice in prayer, informed by the word, so that we can then do whatever he's calling us to do. And then we help other people do that. Right? That's discipleship. Sitting at Jesus' feet then is about being Jesus' disciple. And Mary's decision to sit at Jesus' feet, to be his disciple, is what Jesus is referring to when he tells Martha in verse 42 that Mary has chosen what is better. Right? He's elevating discipleship. This is not about how being is better than doing. This is not about how praying is better than producing. This is about Mary choosing to be a disciple. Now, I don't want you to be too hard on Martha here. Right? In Martha's day, women weren't supposed to sit at a rabbi's feet. I mean, there were certain roles that were culturally acceptable for a woman to play and certain roles where it was not acceptable for a woman to play. Practicing hospitality was acceptable for a woman. Becoming the disciple of a rabbi was not. Jesus blew the lid off that cultural box when he invited women like Mary to sit at his feet. And Mary, despite what everyone, including Martha, would have thought of her, Mary takes Jesus up on his invitation to be his disciple. Even though nobody would have looked at that and said, oh yeah, that's right. I mean, Mary's playing for an audience of one here, folks. Right? Not only did Mary cut against the grain of cultural expectations, she's also willing to appear lazy, sitting at the feet of Jesus while Martha's slaving away in the kitchen. And for many of us, appearing to be lazy is like committing reputation suicide, right? I mean, that's what motivates so many of us to appear or be busier than we are or should be, right? We want to look busy. We don't want to look lazy. I mean, what's the most common response when someone asks how you're doing? Oh, I'm busy, right? I mean, when's the last time that you asked someone how they were doing and they responded, I have all this free time on my hands. I spend about 3 hours a day on Facebook and about 6 hours binge watching my latest Netflix series. And I still have all this extra time on my hands. Said no one ever, right? Of course, some of us are so concerned to not even get close to the lazy line that we will fill up every day with something, sometimes even double booking ourselves to stay busy. And then we wear our busyness around like a badge of justification or a mark of martyrdom, right? And again, sadly, it's often those who are supposed to be spiritually mature who are most guilty of doing this kind of thing. Again, pastors are the worst at this. I've yet to ask a fellow pastor how he's doing and have him respond, I'm living an unhurried, unrushed life these days. Just trying to stay focused on the few things that Jesus is calling me to. Some of you are smiling. I think I would faint dead away if I heard that response. In fact, I remember several years ago, a pastor colleague of mine sharing the highlights of his summer with a small group of us pastors. But before he shared his report, he made sure that he led off with what he really wanted us to know, which was this. Well, I only had one day off all summer. That was how he led off. In other words, whatever he was going to tell us about his report, he wanted to make sure that he communicated in such a way that we viewed him through the lens of an incredibly busy man with a schedule chock full of ministry. Right? He didn't want to appear lazy. But here's the deal, folks. Here's the irony. Busyness is not the opposite of laziness. Busyness is actually a form of laziness. Let me say that again. Busyness is not the opposite of laziness. Busyness is actually a form of laziness. Busyness is being too lazy to intentionally sit at Jesus' feet and listen for his voice and then do those things that he calls us to do. And to then intentionally say no to whatever else is getting in the way of us doing those things, regardless of how it makes us look to other people. Right? I mean, that's one of the things that I love about Mary. Right? She didn't care what other people thought of her. I mean, Mary said no to the culturally expected role of a woman in the first century. She said no to her family. She says no to her sister's indignant request to help her, even though she probably looked lazy in doing so. And she even said no to a very significant ministry opportunity to serve Jesus himself, which is why it's no wonder that Jesus is really proud of Mary. Right? I mean, think about the voice of her culture, the voice of her family, the voice of her religion, her upbringing, right? They're no longer the ruling voices in her life. Mary chose to sit at Jesus' feet. Mary chose to stay attuned to his voice, right? Listening for what he wanted her to be doing, even if it meant saying no to a really important ministry opportunity. Some of the most difficult no's I've ever had to say are to ministry opportunities. And that's because saying no to ministry can make you look or feel like you're not committed to the cause, or you're not committed enough to the cause. But the reality is saying no to these requests is sometimes exactly what we need to do in order to stay true to Jesus and what he's calling us to. See, Jesus wanted Martha to know that nothing is as important as sitting at his feet. Not because sitting at his feet is better than ministry, but because sitting at his feet will inform our ministry. Right? Sitting at his feet informs our ministry. In fact, I wonder if for some of us, it's been a while since we've really sat at Jesus' feet and asked him to clarify or confirm if there's something specific that he wants us to be doing. And again, let me be clear. We are all called to do stuff. Jesus is not taking issue with doing stuff in this story, friends. We're all called to do stuff. The point of this story, and here's kind of this is what I want you to get. The point of this story is that Mary, unlike Martha, understood the order of first sitting at Jesus' feet and listening for his voice, and then doing what he was calling her to do. It's all about the order. It's all about the order. First, we sit at Jesus' feet and we listen for his voice, and then we do what he's calling us to do. See, it's at Jesus' feet, reading his word, listening to his voice. That's where we get clarity and confirmation about the priorities that God has for us. And then from there, we're called to organize our lives around those priorities, which will, by the way, then clarify what else, if anything, we have time to say yes to, and what else we need to say no to. Again, as I said last week, this means courageously dumping out all the sand. Remember that illustration of the sand and the rocks? We're going to dump out the sand. We're going to dump out all the sand and put those rocks into the jar first. Put those things that we know God is calling us to into the jar first, onto the calendar first, right? And then, based on the space that we've got left in the jar of life, after those rocks are in the jar, then I'm able to see, discern more clearly what else I have time to say yes to and what else I need to say no to. Point of transparency, folks, I don't like saying no. It's not my favorite thing to say no. In fact, one of the most challenging aspects of my life right now because of my health is saying no. Right? Saying no a lot, saying no to people and requests and things that I want to say yes to, but I need to say no to so that I can focus my diminished energy, my diminished bandwidth on those few things that I know that God is calling me to. Right? I hope that what I'm dealing with is not a lifetime thorn in the flesh. Right? I'm praying to that end. And I know some of you are praying to that end with me. Thank you. I'm praying that this is not a lifetime thorn in the flesh. But right now, at least for this season that I'm in right now, I have to humbly acknowledge the ceiling of my limitations is lower than it used to be. Right? And sometimes just saying it out loud just kills the spirit of pride that's in here. I'm not picking on myself anymore. You got a spirit of pride in you too. Right? I got to acknowledge the ceiling of my limitations. It's lower than it used to be. Right? And so I need to be even more intentional in this season. I got to be even more intentional about saying no to those things that are distracting me from what limited time, energy, bandwidth I've got to say yes to those things that I know God's calling me to. Just like you, it's a battle for me to say the right yeses and the right nos. And the only way I can keep them straight is if I am consistently sitting at the feet of Jesus. Right? Reading his word, listening for his voice, and then writing down those things that I sense him calling me to be about. And then organizing and calendarizing my life around those things that he's calling me to be about. When I get back from the clinic in California in a couple weeks, I'm going to wrap up this series by describing what this process looks like for me. This morning, though, I want to encourage you to consider a few next steps. You're going to see them on the back of your message notes. You'll see them up on the screen behind me. Very simply, 3 next steps. The first one is this. Spend some time later this week sitting at Jesus' feet, right? Reading his word, listening for anything he might be calling you to. Let me just make a plug for Bible 260. We got hundreds of Trinity family members who are a part of Trinity, part of Bibles 260, and I think there's still time. Can they sign up today? Is today the last day? Today's the last day, all right? If you want to be a part of Bible 260, right? The primary way we hear from God is through his word. And so I would just invite you to set aside some time, even just 30 minutes. I was actually thinking this last week, for those of you who are not going to do Bible 260, or maybe if you want to do something in addition to Bible 260, like if I would just choose one book of the Bible, and I'm not trying to set canon above canon, one book above the other, 65 books. But if you just sat down and for 30 minutes read through the book of Ephesians, right? These first 3 chapters, all about who God is, who we are in him through Christ, right? And then 3 chapters of practical living it out. Like, just take 30 minutes, read through the book of Ephesians, inviting God to speak to you, inviting Jesus to speak to you. Pen and paper right next to you. Take a few minutes to spend some time sitting at Jesus' feet. Number 2, and I've already alluded to it, writing down anything you sense him saying to you. Right? Writing down anything you sense him saying to you. And then number 3, putting those things on the calendar so that you can be about those things that he's calling you to be about. Folks, that's discipleship. Like, that's just a very simple definition of discipleship, which is what we're all called to, right? We're called to be people who sit at his feet, reading his word, listening for his voice, and then doing whatever he's calling us to do, and then helping other people do that too. That's discipleship. So those are your next steps. Spend some time later this week sitting at Jesus' feet, reading his word, listening for his voice. And then number 2, write down anything you sense him saying to you. And then number 3, put those things on the calendar that you sense him calling you to be about. That's discipleship. Sometimes we get it all mixed up in our head. It sounds like one of those words. It's like, I don't even know what a disciple is. That's discipleship. And then helping other people to do that. Worship team, I'm going to invite you to come on ahead. I'm going to pray. And I just want to pray a prayer of asking the Holy Spirit to help some of you who are going to take those steps. That you'd hear from him. That he'd speak to you through his word. And that he would help you to say yes to what he's calling you to say yes to, and have the courage and the tenacity to say no to whatever he's calling you to say no to. Let's pray. Father, I do thank you for what you've done for us in Christ. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus, that you were willing to say the ultimate yes to the Father so that we could be forgiven. You were resolved to go to the cross. Hallelujah. So that we could be reconciled to the Father, adopted into the family. Thank you. Lord, by your Spirit, I pray that you would just renew in us this gratitude for what you've done for us, that we would want to live our lives in alignment with your purposes for us, that we would submit our agenda to your agenda, that we would be open to you speaking to us. So Jesus, just like you spoke to Mary 2,000 years ago, I would pray by your Spirit that you would speak to us. Those who set aside some time later this week, that as they read through your word, they might hear your voice. And that you would then give us the discernment to know what that means we now need to say no to, so that we can say yes to you, so that we can say yes to everything you're calling us to. Lord, we're so grateful. We're so grateful that you love us, that you care for us. I pray for my friends. I pray for my brothers and sisters. Lord, that you would lead them and guide them so that we might become more and more the people you created us and saved us to be. May that be so. By your Spirit. We know it's only by your Spirit that this can be brought about. Bring it about for Jesus' sake and in his name. And everyone agreed and said, amen. Let's worship.
Worthy of every song we could ever sing.